From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the African and Middle East Division. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all here to attend this special presentation with Harry Boonen, who will talk to us about his new book, Never Tell a Boy Not to Fight. As I always do, I make a little presentation about our division, and our division is made up of 3 sections: the African, the Near East, and the Hebraic sections. We're responsible for materials from 78 countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Sahara. And for the Hebraic section, we collect materials from all over the world. We're also very active in acquiring materials, we store our materials, we develop our collections, we brief our visitors, and we serve the collections in this reading room. We also invite scholars and experts who have done research and used our collections to share their insights and their findings with our patrons, with our audiences here in the United States and across the world. And we like to have, especially authors who've written new books and done research, to share not only the content of their research, but how they've done their research. So we are particularly happy to welcome Harry Boonen today, because he's making a presentation on a topic that we rarely, if ever, discuss at the library, namely boxing. But Harry Boonen is a local historian from Philadelphia, whose work is in many ways unique, as it focuses on boxers who came from the Jewish quarter of Philadelphia. As I looked Harry up on Google, I found a little announcement about this project that was before the book had been written, where he introduces himself and then adds, "I'm looking for stories, letters, diaries, photographs of the lesser-known Jewish fighters, managers such as Phil Glassman, Bubu Huff, love the name, trainers such as Kudels Reinfeld, and sports writers such as Lou Jaffe of Philadelphia. Any personal stories or personal contacts to families would be greatly appreciated." The moment you read this, you really are excited. You want to know, did people give the letters? Did they share their photographs? You know, who were the people? Who were the stories? I mean, it's a hook that immediately makes you want to read the book and to know how that book got written. So I'm sure he's going to share with us his story and the story of the boxer that he's writing about. But now, our very own Sharon Horowitz, the senior reference librarian in the Hebraic section, will introduce Harry Boonen and the program. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. On behalf of the Hebraic section, let me thank you all for coming to today's program. My name is Sharon Horowitz. I'm a reference librarian in the Hebraic section. The Hebraic section marks its beginnings in 1912 with the receipt of 10,000 Hebrew books and pamphlets whose purchase was made possible by a gift from the New York philanthropist Jacob Schiff. From those humble beginnings, our collections have grown to around 250,000 items in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Persian, and other Hebraic script languages. The Hebraic section also includes an important collection of books in the languages of Ge'ez, Amharic, and Tigrinya, the languages of Ethiopia, past and present. Our section's holdings are particularly strong in the subject areas of Bible and rabbinics, liturgy, Hebrew language and literature, responsa, and Jewish history. 2 of our missions in this division are to publicize our collections and to bring people into the library. And one way we accomplish this second goal is by holding lectures and having programs such as the one we are hosting here today. And now, a word about our speaker. Mr. Harry Boonen received his BA from Pennsylvania State University and his JD from Temple University. Before retiring, he worked for many years as a lawyer for the U.S. Navy. Mr. Boonen devotes much of his time to Jewish genealogy and to Philadelphia Jewish history. He was the founding president of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Philadelphia, editor of their newsletter, and was honored by the society for lifetime dedication. Harry has published many articles in the Jewish Genealogy Journal of Otenu. The book we will hear about today is his fourth. Never Tell a Boy Not to Fight describes the lost world of Philadelphia Jewish boxing and the story of immigrant Jewish boys who literally fought their way up from poverty. One item of business before we hear from Mr. Boonen. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcasting. There will be a formal question and answer period after the lecture at which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. Please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Harry Boonen. One more thing. There are questionnaires asking for feedback that are going to be distributed. If they're not on your chair, they will be. So if you could fill them out and hand them in before you leave, that would be appreciated. And also the book, Never Tell a Boy Not to Fight, is for sale in the back, and Mr. Boonen will be very happy to sign them if anybody wants. Thank you.
Thank you for the very nice introductions, and welcome you all on such a beautiful day. A question about letters has been brought up. Whether I ever got any letters? Well, that shows you how little I knew when I started about boxers. Boxers wear 8-ounce gloves, and I guess they can't write letters with their gloves on. But boxers do not write letters, which is a big disappointment. If any of you want to be a biographer, make sure that the person you're writing about writes letters or writes something. It's difficult without them, without a diary. How did I get into this? 24 years ago, I was working for the Navy, and I found myself in London one day, London, England, and I had a few hours off, and I decided to take a walking tour of the old East End of London. It was a wonderful tour. I thought I would do the same thing when I came back to Philadelphia. Nobody was doing it. I started them, and I did it for 15 years. And what came out of it was a book called The Jewish Quarter of Philadelphia. And when I finished the book, I was frustrated because I felt I really hadn't told the full story of the Jewish Quarter and the Russian Jews who settled there. So I wrote a second book about a synagogue in the area. And the synagogue, I was surprised to find, had parents, 3 parents, that had sons who were professional boxers. And I thought that that was odd. Whether it was or not, I'm not sure. And then I found out that one of the premier boxing managers in Philadelphia was also a member of the synagogue. So I finished the synagogue book, and I thought I was done. But the boxers fascinated me. I was intrigued. And I thought I would do a little bit of research and see if there was a possibility that a book could be written. I found out that Philadelphia, a century ago, had many dozen professional boxers. In 1928, there were more Jewish boxers for an ethnicity than any other ethnicity in the United States. It only lasted a short time, and I guess that put me over the top, and I said, well, I guess 3 books make a trilogy, and I started on my boxing book. It took 8 years, and this is basically the story. Let me get started. This photograph comes from the Library of Congress. and it is from the Association of Newsboys from Cincinnati. It's a very interesting picture for many reasons. A lot of the Jewish newsboys in Philadelphia were not lucky enough to have any kind of training like this, but this seems to be a training room. The boys, some of the boys you'll see are on bare feet, other boys have shoes on. You'll notice there's no adults in the room, and the boys are learning from each other. The remarkable part about this picture is that there are both African American and white boys together, and they seem from the picture to have been getting along and learning and concentrating despite all of the prejudice that existed around them at that time. In fact, if you'll look on the right-hand side of your screen, there is one of the larger boys who's standing next to, on his right, a white boy, and he has his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. And you can see from this little fact how close the boys were. They were intently, and you can see in their eyes how intently they are in learning. This next picture comes from Philadelphia, and again involves the boys. Newsboys, a lot of Jews were newsboys at that time. I was unable to find any kind of study in Philadelphia or Cincinnati or New York, but I did find a study of newsboys in Denver, Colorado a few years later. And of the 250 newsboys that were studied, 125, a half of them were Jewish, which I found really surprising in Denver, Colorado. This particular picture shows on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a girl on the swing, and if you look in the middle, in the back, there's a single girl who's reading a book, but in the front, there's two boys who are practicing the art of boxing, the manly art of boxing, and the teacher doesn't seem to be interfering with them. She's letting it go, so this was something today you would see a baseball game, maybe the kids are playing ball against the wall, but that's what the kids practiced then. To get into boxing in Philadelphia, which is probably like all of the towns in the eastern part of the United States, one of the most unusual venues was called a cyclorama, and the picture of it is here. This picture, as stated, was taken in 1887, and this is where the first Jewish fighter fought. A cyclorama is a painting that's mounted on the inside of a round building. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the most popular cycloramas after the Civil War. And you can see it if you go to, has anybody here gone to the Gettysburg Museum, the new museum they opened up? They have a cyclorama up there, and it has 20,000 life-size figures. The building on the right is the same building. It's painted white here, and it's called the Winter Circus. This was converted from the cyclorama to the Winter Circus for boxing in 1893. First, there were vaudeville shows here, and after the vaudeville shows, after the vaudeville shows, the interest waned in the city, and the manager thought he would try to bring in boxing, and one of the boxers he brought in was Jewish. This is a famous painting. You may recognize the painting by Thomas Eakins. This is taken, Eakins painted it in 1898, and it was in the interior of the same building. You can see in this painting on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a press box right above the policeman who's standing there. In the press box were three news journalists, I guess you'd call them sports writers, although they didn't really call them sports writers at that time, because it wasn't a profession, and a fellow that named the round, and then they also had a telegraph operator. So if you were a boxing manager and wanted to get your story out, you didn't have to go to a telegraph office. You could do it right from the boxing arena. The fellow in the foreground is the timekeeper, and you can see that the ropes in the ring are already a foot or more inside the raised platform that they fought on. So if the fellow was knocked through the ropes, he didn't fall right away onto the floor, which is quite a fall, but he would fall on the edge and hopefully stay within the platform. This is a fellow, S. Henry Pincus, who was the first promoter at the Winter Circus. He was also an inventor, filed 6 patents at the Library of Congress, and remained in the fight game until he ended up being arrested. In 1898, the fight game was still considered semi-legal in some towns and completely illegal in others. He finally had enough, and he left Philadelphia for New York. This is a picture of the first Jewish fighter. He had 60 professional Jewish fights. He fought from 1893 to 1905. His name was Izzy Strauss, but they called him the Hebrew Cyclone. Both of those words would have been a surprise to the boxing public and to the general public. First of all, most Jews were not known as Hebrews, and that was to give him sort of an aura of maybe a biblical warrior rather than a street Jew. They called him a Hebrew. A cyclone is some boxers, many black boxers were named Cyclone because he kept his arms moving all the time. So this was the Hebrew Cyclone. He had 60 fights. Of the 60 fights, there were 10 disqualifications. At that time, the press did not write about anti-Semitism in boxing or in baseball, so you have to sort of use your imagination, which is not a good way to write a book or to tell a story. But the 10 disqualifications, none of them were explained. Strauss bit his opponent, kicked his opponent, and wrestled his opponent to the ground. But not one of the reporters who looked into these disqualifications stated why they happened. And so we just have our imagination to go on. And this is where writing a biography, letters would be so important, or a diary, where the person would admit what happened. But the newspapers were not going to admit anti-Semitism at this time, at least in Philadelphia. In other towns they did. Philadelphia was very proper, and everything went on the QT. The next story I'm going to tell you will be partially my imagination, probably 100%, of what happened in a fight on June the 15th, 1906 in Philadelphia. This is a picture of the National Boxing Club where the story took place. To tell you the story, I'd like to take you back, both chronologically and geographically, to Russia. Almost all the fighters who fought at this time either came from Russia or were born to parents who came from Russia. And I'll take you back to a little shtetl in the southern part of Russia in the fall of 1905. That fall in the south of Russia, there were 657 pogroms. Pogroms were organized attacks by the government and the police and the army against the Jewish citizens of different towns. In our imagined story, the fellow comes out of the house, his spouse is inside, his children are hiding in terror under the bed. The pogrom crowd has just destroyed the town and left, and he goes outside to look at the street. The street is muddy. In the street are all the broken furniture from the pogrom. And on top of the broken furniture, the pogromchiks, the Russians who like to make pogroms against Jews, had cut open all the feather pillows that they could find and spread them all over. And this is one of the marks that they left when the pogrom was over. And he thought to himself, what am I doing here? I'm going to tell my spouse and tell my kids we're getting out of here. That fall, he sold his belongings, had enough money to get a train ticket, and he left what my uncle called dark and miserable Russia for a new land, a golden land. They traveled by train to Hamburg. When you got to Hamburg in those days, remember, this is the winter of 1906, you were 2 miles from the ship. You had to walk with your family, and you had little babies, so everybody had to carry a baby in their luggage 2 miles to the ship. The ship went across the North Sea in winter, very rough crossing, to Grimsby or Hull in the east coast of Britain. And from there, they crossed by rail to Liverpool, and Liverpool took them to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, this would be in January or February in this hypothetical story, they settled where all of the immigrants settled at that time. This would be January or February of 1906. That was the 1 year where the Jews had 125,000 immigrant Jews who came from Russia, the largest immigration of any year in our history or in Russian history. He got a job in one of the sweatshops. The sweatshops at that time operated with 39 different functions. You were taught one function, sew the buttons on the collar, sew the buttons on the shirt, and that's what you did all day. It could be taught, you didn't have to know English. Everyone in the sweatshop spoke Yiddish, and that was what he learned. He noticed after a few months there, now we're in the May and June of 1906, that the other men in the shop who were speaking Yiddish were talking about a prize fight, and he didn't know what a prize fight was. And they told him that 2 men get in a ring, and in a certain number of rounds, they try to win the fight. Well, there was a, he felt, well, maybe the best thing for me to do is to go to a fight and see what goes on there. All the fellows in the shop seemed to, you could buy a ticket for $0.25. He said, I just won't tell my wife about spending $0.25 on this, and I'll go over there Friday night. Maybe she'll think I went to synagogue. He woke up the morning of 15 June, 1906, and reading the headlines, the fellows in the shop who could read English discovered that there was a pogrom in Białystok, Poland. And normally in Philadelphia, when there was a large pogrom, they had protest meetings in all of the synagogues in the southern part of Philadelphia. So he then had a choice between going to synagogue that night and attending the protest meetings or going to the fight. And he said, if I'm going to be a real American and understand what this country's about, I'm going to go to the prize fight. So he went to the National Boxing Club, which we see here, and he went inside. When he got inside, he looked around and he wondered, I wonder who all these people are. Are they Jews? Are they Jews like me? Or are they other people? And he couldn't quite determine who they were because unlike Russia, where the peasants and the Jews wore much different clothing, in the United States, it was hard to discern by clothing who anyone was. And then the fighters came out. The first fighter to come out is one of the most popular fighters who ever fought in the United States. His name was Joe Gans. I don't know if anybody ever heard his name. Today he's not well known. But in 1906, there was no heavyweight champion. Jim Jeffries had just retired, and Gans was the lightweight champion, and the lightweight division at those days was considered the second most interesting behind the heavyweights. Gans was to die of tuberculosis 4 years after this, but I think he was the most popular fighter, black or white, at that time. And he's always been considered one of the best fighters pound for pound, whoever fought in the United States. He fought against a Jew by the name of Harry Lewis. And Lewis's real name was Besterman. Lewis had had 77 fights before this, but never met anyone the caliber of Joe Gans. Joe Gans was a lightweight champion, and this was not a championship fight. But the National AC that night, June 15th, 1906, was completely filled. There were 5,000 people at the club. Just to compare that, the Chicago Cubs of 1906, who finally went to the World Series but didn't win it that year, won it the next year, and with the double play combination of Tinker, Devers, to Chance, they could only draw 4,000 people to the ballpark to play the Phillies, where this boxing match drew 5,000. The first thing that our imagined attendee thought was, in Russia, a Jew couldn't be an official street sweeper, And here, he's looking up that this fella, Harry Lewis, is eligible to fight the lightweight champion. He happens to be an African American, but what stuck in our imagined fellow's mind is that as a Jew, he had a right to fight him. And so he recognized right away, not in a courtroom or not at a naturalization ceremony, but the equality that exists at the lowest level of American society, and he liked it. The fight went 6 rounds. At that time, they had 6-round fights in Philadelphia. When Gans and Lewis went in the ring, they shook hands, and he took note of that. But when the fight was over, and it was more or less a draw, the fighters shook hands again and smiled at one another. And that meant a lot to him, that there were 2 diverse ethnicities, if we'll call it that, who could get along with each other even after they pummeled each other for 6 rounds. Neither one was particularly hurt, and Harry Lewis's name then skyrocketed because everyone felt that although he did not win the fight, he had put up a wonderful battle and that he would go far in the boxing game. Harry Lewis is one of the stories that's in the book. For you who read old newspapers, you may be familiar with illustrations. They had photographs. This is an illustration of that fight. And they illustrated, the cartoonist illustrated people the way they saw them or the way their editor wanted them to be portrayed. If you wanted to show a minority in an unfavorable light, you could take an African American and paint his lips thick. You could take a Jew and give him a Jewish nose. Either one of those things would accomplish what the editor wanted, and that's what the paper here, I won't name the paper. This is another cartoonist by the name of Tad Dorgan. I don't know if the name Tad Dorgan means anything to anybody, but he's very famous today as a coiner of phrases. He coined them back when he was a boxing writer and was a very fair man. Here's an illustration of the same 2 fighters, but there's no derogatory pen marks in his drawing. Gans on the right is shown as hitting Lewis in the stomach, while avoiding or slipping Lewis's right hand, which goes harmlessly over his shoulder. But both men are pictured like they are. Lewis a little bit on the heavy side, Gans slightly angular. And it's a better picture of what they really look like. This is one of the few really interesting and subtle, or not too subtle, depending on how you look at it, ideas of the tail of the tape. The tail of the tape is usually a measurement of the fighter's different parts of his anatomy, such as biceps, legs, ankles, and things like that. You read down, and the only line that's of some interest, of great interest, is the last line. Now, this is the tail of the tape, and they always stop at ankle, but this didn't stop at ankle. It went to nationality. And the fellow on the left, Howard Baker, was identified as an Irish American. Well, you would think the fellow on the right would be identified as a Jewish American. I won't ask you the question why they identified him as a Jew, but they did identify in the narrative that Howard Baker had baby skin and a blonde pompadour. So those were two very relevant factors to the boxing match. I'm going to skip that. Harry Lewis later went over to France and fought in France, and this is a battle he had with Georges Carpentier, who was a famous French fighter and a famous French fighter, flyer in the First World War. This picture, I love this picture from 1913. This is a drugstore in London, and it has two pictures on the left. One of the pictures, it's all in Yiddish. One of the pictures in Yiddish says, Rabbi attacked by Shiksa. And the two papers on the right are papers about American fights. So out of the 7 papers that are shown in front of this drugstore, 2 of them have to do with Yiddish, or they're in Yiddish, and the other 2 have to do with boxing, to show you how popular boxing was in London in 1913. The fellow on the left is one of the Jews in Philadelphia that I did not write about, but he won the lightweight title, the junior lightweight title, and the featherweight title in the 1920s. This is Lou Tendler, and Lou Tendler was the most famous. I don't know if his name means anything here in Washington. In Philadelphia, almost everybody knows him, like people know Jack Dempsey in New York. Lou Tendler, after he retired, opened a restaurant. In fact, he was the one who gave Dempsey the idea of opening a restaurant. And they both were in the restaurant business for 25 years. When there were big fights in Philadelphia, like all the fights of Jersey Joe Walcott and Marciano in the early 50s, and Joe Louis, all the writers from New York would come down to Tendler's restaurant. Everybody gathered there. It was a great meeting place for writers and a great place for writers to get the material for their stories. They may not have had letters, but they knew where to go to find Broadway characters, and it wasn't on Broadway. One of the favorites in Tendler's was Damon Runyon. Damon Runyon was always there. There's a story that he was told by Hearst, he worked for William Randolph Hearst, covering the 1936 convention when Roosevelt was nominated and eventually won, that he should get to Philadelphia. Since Roosevelt was such a shoo-in at the Democratic convention, Damon Runyon spent the whole week of the convention in Tendler's restaurant. And it goes on to say all the stories he wrote. He wrote a story called Little Miss Marker. I don't know if you've ever seen it. That was made into a movie and starred Shirley Temple, and that was one of her roles that really shot her to fame. This is the street that Tendler was born on in Philadelphia. Years later, that's one of his first fighters. When Tendler fought another Jewish fighter, they were both Jewish, they got in the ring and they couldn't hit each other. They just couldn't do it. So there were 4,000 people in the arena. By the second round, there were 2,000 people. By the third round, there was about a dozen people left because it was a fake. When the reporters went into the room to ask Tendler, what was this all about, he cried. So sometimes we think of fighters as being really tough guys, but it doesn't mean a tough guy can't cry. This is another one of his fights. This is Tendler in training. He trained at a millionaire's mansion. How he wangled this, I couldn't quite figure out, but the guy was such a nice guy. He had a 28-room mansion, and when Tendler came to prepare for a fight, he put every one of Tendler's people, there were 28 of them, he gave them each a Victrola so they could play music before they went to bed. This is another boxing venue in Philadelphia. That's a picture of it empty. This is a picture of it full. And these are taken in the early 1920s. This you can't see too much of, but Benny Leonard was the lightweight champion, probably the best Jewish fighter there ever was. And these are the people celebrating. In the picture, you can see a snare drum, a bass drum, a clarinet, and even a violin, and letters at the top. This is a picture at the place where he was training. Tendler always had a ukulele, but this is not a ukulele. It looks to me like a banjo. And I don't know, he's playing it left-handed. Can you play a banjo left-handed? You don't have to answer that. These are some of the guys. Tendler was never seen alone. He was a great guy, a great fella, and takes up over half the book. His stories are wonderful. This is my favorite picture from the newspaper, My Son the Fighter, and you can see who the mother is and who the fighter is in this picture. The two men in the back are his brothers, and the person on the left is his sister, and all four of them have their arms around their youngest member. This was something that Tendler handed out at his restaurant of advice. It has all advice, and I know you can't read it, but the last line says, the greatest thing in all the world, bar none, is love. And that was the way he felt. He gave out 300,000 of these free. They're postcards on the other side. And this is the last picture. This picture was taken about a month after the book came out. And it's sort of like an archaeological dig, because everybody in Philly saw this, that they knocked down a parking garage next to where Tendler's restaurant was, and lo and behold, there's a sign that says Tendler's Restaurant. Nobody had heard of it or thought of it in the last 20 or 30 years. It closed in 1970. That's 46 years ago. So it made quite a hit. Well, that's the story of the book on boxing. Sorry I didn't have more time to talk to you, but I'd love to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Who were the trainers? Were they old boxers? Who trained them? Who prepared the boxing matches? Who trained those young men to become boxers?
The question is, who prepared? In other words, was there an organization? Was this organized?
Was it organized? Were they trainers?
Okay, boxing was very unorganized. It's a very good question. In 1905 and 1906, there were 16 boxers who were killed in the ring. And I knew that there were problems in football, and a lot of the articles said that boxing is not as rough or more rough than football, and I wondered just how rough football was in 1906. Looking it up, ironically, what I found was there were 16 football players killed in 1905 and 1906. I continued and I looked up horse racing, and I found out that there were 16 jockeys who were killed in 1906. 8 of them on a horse, and the other 8 were killed in other incidents. So there was a lot of, there was danger in all the sports. But football was organized, to answer your question, and football addressed the flying wedge in different forms of football to lessen the danger. The way the deaths in boxing were handled was that they would handle it as a criminal matter. And Harry Lewis, and I spent a lot of time in the book on this, Harry Lewis actually killed a man in the ring, and they charged him with murder. So that's what boxing got, because they weren't organized. You asked a question about who arranged the matches. The matches were arranged by whoever was the best negotiator. Each boxer had someone looking out for him, somebody in the family, or he had no one looking out for him and looked out for himself. Most of those guys got taken advantage of. But there was an awful lot of skullduggery in boxing. Probably was in football and baseball too. I didn't write about them. But I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I would say it was basically an unorganized sport, and no one tried to organize it before 1915. By 1930s, when prohibition was being phased out, and mafia and different gangs felt that there was money to be made in boxing, then the criminal element entered boxing in a big way at the management and promotional level. Yes, sir.
What point in the century did the Jewish involvement in boxing start to taper off?
Can you speak a little louder?
At what point in the century did the Jewish involvement with boxing start to taper off?
That's a good question. The question is, at what point in this century did Jewish boxing tend to taper off? And the answer to that is when Congress passed the Quota Act in 1924. Up till 1924, there was another Quota Act in 21, but in 24, they cut off all, for practical purposes, immigration from Russia. Almost all of the fighters did it for money. Almost all of the fighters were poor. And all of the fighters knew that if their father had died, like Tendler's father, somebody had to make the money for the family. And they can make a lot more money fighting than they could being newsboys. He was a newsboy and a fighter, both at the same time. And so, beginning in 1924, there was no more immigration. So then the boys that were being brought up, the Jewish boys, felt that, gee, this boxing is kind of rough. Maybe I'm better off going to college or something like that, becoming a lawyer, becoming a doctor. If this is really an open country, and we know that there were restrictions at Harvard and different Ivy League schools, that it might still be a better risk than getting in the ring and getting my brains knocked out. So it started to drop off as far as new young boxers, I would say in the early 1930s. But during the 1930s, they still had full-grown Jewish boxers in the 1920s. But if you went to a training ring at that time, there would be no young boys, 6 or 7, looking up at their heroes. There would be none of those because there were no immigrants. In 1906, I think I mentioned, there were 125,000 Jews from Russia who came to the United States. In 1933, there were 2,000. That's how effective the Quota Act of 1924 was. And then everybody knows the story when Hitler came to power. Any other questions? Well, I thank you all very much for inviting me, and hope you enjoyed the talk.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.